Hello, Sunday School teachers, preachers, and students. Welcome to SundaySchoolPreacher.com. In this week's lesson, Solomon closes his dedication ceremony in much the same way as he opened it, by blessing the people. Solomon is not a priest. He's not the high priest. He's not even a Levite. But seemingly, he takes on priestly roles by leading the nation in prayer, offering sacrifices, and giving a speech during the dedication ceremony. Keep in mind that this is a dedication ceremony and the people have just had a worship experience. They have experienced a theophany. They've experienced the presence of God in the thick cloud, and they've witnessed Solomon leading the nation in prayer in the presence of God. Solomon had already reminded the assembly of his father David's desire to make a permanent home for the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. He's prayed his prayer. He's made his 9 petitions and requests known to God. And now, just as he began the dedication service by blessing the assembly, he closes the dedication service by blessing the assembly also. One key idea surrounding this week's text include the term, the sacrificial system. Wherever you are in the world, thank you for subscribing to this channel. I love to hear your thoughts on the lesson in the comments below. If you subscribe to this channel and click the notifications bell, you'll be notified as soon as I upload next week's lesson. Plus, that lets YouTube know you like this channel and they'll promote it more. And if you have Wi-Fi in your church Sunday school classroom, this channel is a good way to teach and discuss this week's lesson. I provide a concise overview of background, context, characters, themes, and topics that gets to the point, saves you time, and enhances your own teaching and study. If that's what you're looking for, you're in the right place. But the only way I know this is helpful is if you subscribe, click the like button, or say so in the comments. If you want to support this channel, I accept correspondence and gifts at my PayPal address, https://paypal.me/SundaySchoolPreacher, or snail mail at 1590 Jonesboro Road Southeast, Box 150032, Atlanta, Georgia 30315. So with that said, welcome again to SundaySchoolPreacher.com, and let's go to work. As always, we begin with the background for today's text. This is the 4th and final lesson from 1 Kings, the 8th chapter in this quarter. In this week's background, I give attention to the writer's concern with faithfulness and the covenant. In previous lessons, all in the 8th chapter, the unknown prophet who wrote this text mentioned both the Davidic covenant and the Mosaic covenant. And just as a refresher, the Lexham Bible Dictionary defines the Mosaic covenant as the covenant mediated between God and Israel at Mount Sinai when Israel received the law, including the 10 Commandments. It's also known as the Old Covenant or the First Covenant. Lexham defines the Davidic covenant as the promise made by Yahweh that he would establish for King David a house or a dynasty of kings who would perpetually reign over God's people. Both of these covenants are important to the writer of Kings, and he is especially concerned with explaining how and why the nation of Israel and Judah can be blessed if they obey the commands of God. Nelson's Bible Handbook explains the welfare of Israel and Judah depends upon the faithfulness of the people and their king to the covenant. In the view of the writer, keeping the covenant and being faithful to the covenant and God is of utmost importance in explaining how the nations had success and failure. Keep in mind that 1st and 2nd Kings covers a 400-year period from before the death of David to the ascension of Solomon on the throne, through Solomon's death and subsequent dividing of the kingdom, all the way to the Assyrian and Babylonian captivities. And as I noted last week, this book came about through 2 editions over the 400-year history that it covers. This is a book of history. The writer is reflecting that history, and he wants people to know that faithfulness to God and the covenant is what brings success. Kings is one of the 12 books of history in the Old Testament, and the writer is telling us a portion of the history of the kings of Judah and Israel. As I noted last week, previous lesson backgrounds included the similarities between 1st and 2nd Chronicles and 1st and 2nd Kings, how Chronicles uses Kings as a source, how Kings covers almost 400 years of history, when each edition of Kings was written pre-exilic and during the exile, how Kings is a theological interpretation of the monarchy of the kings of Judah and Israel until the reign of Ahaziah, a brief explanation of God's dwelling places, and the major divisions of 1 Kings. This 8th chapter of 1 Kings deals with the dedication of the temple, Solomon's speech at the dedication, his prayer of dedication, his blessing of the assembly, and finally his sacrificial offerings. The focus of last week's lesson was Solomon's dedication prayer. This week, our lesson tells the story of how Solomon blesses the assembly after he finishes his dedicatory prayer. An important term to consider about this text is the sacrificial system. So let's review last week and see how it connects to this week. In last week's lesson, Solomon continued the temple dedication service. I noted how the dedication included worship, prayer, and praise. In Solomon's dedication prayer, he asked for God's blessings, making 9 specific petitions to God. I also stressed that this event was a worship experience. Solomon and the people experienced a theophany. A theophany is the visible manifestation of God. God made God's self visible in the thick cloud that filled the temple. Solomon faced the temple, raised his hands toward heaven, and began to pray his prayer of dedication. He knew exactly who he was praying to. Solomon was praying to the creator of the universe who already owned all and knows all. Solomon had no basis upon which to request anything except God's beloved mercy. As he prayed, he made known his 9 petitions and led the people in prayer before God's presence. Townsend and Boyd's commentary titled this week's lesson, Solomon's Blessing. Standard Lesson Commentary titles this week's lesson, Solomon Anticipates Praise. The scripture text comes from 1 Kings, the 8th chapter, verses 54 through 61. I'll read that text for you now from the New Revised Standard Version. We begin with the section entitled, Solomon Blesses the Assembly. Now when Solomon finished offering all this prayer and this plea to the Lord, he arose from facing the altar of the Lord, where he had knelt with his hands outstretched toward heaven. He stood and blessed all the assembly of Israel with a loud voice. Blessed be the Lord, who has given rest to his people Israel according to all that he has promised. Not one word has failed of all his good promise, which he spoke through his servant Moses. The Lord our God be with us, as he was with our ancestors. May he not leave us or abandon us, but incline our hearts to him, to walk in all his ways, and to keep his commandments, his statutes, and his ordinances, which he commanded our ancestors. Let these words of mine, with which I pleaded before the Lord, be near to the Lord our God day and night, and may he maintain the cause of his servant and the cause of his people Israel each day as each day requires, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the Lord is God, there is no other. Therefore devote yourselves completely to the Lord our God, walking in his statutes and keeping his commandments as at this day. That's the reading of the word, so let's see what takes place in this passage. The lesson opens at chapter 8, verse 54, with Solomon having concluded his dedicatory prayer. The people have experienced a theophany. They've experienced the presence of God in the thick cloud, and they've witnessed Solomon leading the nation in prayer in the presence of God. In this dedication, they have had a worship experience. Solomon has given a speech. He reminded the assembly of his father David's desire to make a permanent home for the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. He has prayed his prayer. He's made his 9 pleas and requests known to God. And now, just as he began this dedication service by blessing the assembly, he closes the dedication service by blessing the assembly also. This verse notes that Solomon arose from kneeling on his knees. Townsend commentary notes that this is the first mention in Scripture of someone kneeling in prayer. In verse 55, as he faces the altar of the Lord, Solomon stands up and with a loud voice blesses the assembly of Israel. Townsend commentary notes that to bless the people was the exclusive privilege of the priests. Check Numbers, the 6th chapter, verses 23 through 27. Solomon's blessing here was actually a prayer of blessing and praise to God. So it may seem as if Solomon is taking on priestly roles by leading the nation in prayer and seemingly blessing the people, but he is not a priest, and he performs all his acts of dedication and worship outside this newly built temple. In verse 56, Solomon declares, "Blessed be the Lord who has given rest to his people Israel." When Solomon speaks of this rest that the Lord has given, he's talking about peace in the land. Solomon is praying that the unified nation would now enjoy a time of rest from war with its neighboring nations. The pulpit commentary notes that only under Solomon were the Philistines brought into complete subjection. So this should be a time of peace and prosperity. There's no need for a mobile tabernacle housed in a tent that can be moved from place to place. If the nation is at peace, they can have a permanent temple, a building that doesn't need to be moved. Solomon continues, "Not one word has failed of all his good promise, which he spoke through his servant Moses." Solomon is once again reminding the people that God is a covenant keeper. God keeps God's promises. In verse 57, Solomon asks God to be with them as God was with his ancestors. In other words, Solomon wants God to be the God that parted the Red Sea. He wants God to be the God that defeated Pharaoh's army. He wants God to be the God that blessed a young David to kill a giant named Goliath. Solomon wants God to be with them the way God was with his ancestors. He knows God is a miracle-working God, a way-making God, and an omnipotent God. Solomon continues, "May God not leave us nor forsake us." Again, Solomon knows that if the people of Israel are to enjoy this rest, the presence, the power, and the protection of God must be with them. In verse 58, Solomon says, that God may incline our hearts to God. He knows that they must be committed to God. Their hearts must be inclined to God, not just in word and deed, but in spirit also. When their heart is inclined unto God and not unto their own ways and not unto the ways of the neighboring nations, then God will be their God and God will be their deliverer. In verse 59, Solomon essentially says, let these words, these prayers I've prayed, these supplications I've made, let these words be close to you, O God. He says this so that God might keep the cause or give success to Solomon and to the people of Israel. In verse 60, Solomon says that all the people of the earth may know that the Lord is God. Solomon is standing before a newly built temple. He has had a worship experience in the presence of God. Solomon knows that God is the God of this universe and not just the God for Israel. In verse 43, he said, then here in heaven your dwelling place, and do according to all that listen, to all that the foreigner calls to you, so that all the peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you as do your people Israel, and so that they may know that your name has been invoked on this house that I've built. Solomon wants God to show God's self as not just the God of Israel, but the God of all who will call upon God's name. In verse 61, Solomon closes his blessing with a plea to the people to be completely devoted to God, keeping God's statutes and commandments. Solomon knows that if his people are to be blessed, that they'll have to keep the covenant, to remain faithful, and to keep the commands of God. Well, that's what takes place in the text. Let's give the text some context. Westminster's Dictionary of Theological Terms defines bless or blessing as to praise, petition for divine favor, wish someone well, or convey favor, used biblically to describe God's actions, as in the frequent blessings that Jesus conferred on people. A closing blessing or benediction has traditionally been a feature of Christian worship. Our text today highlights Solomon offering a blessing that's really directed to God. In what ways do we petition God for favor, to wish someone well, or to convey favor? Are we blessing others also? Or are we focused on requesting blessings only for ourselves? A key word, not necessarily in the text, but good for discussion, or this key term is the sacrificial system. Scott Langston and E. Ray Clendenin write in the Holman Illustrated Bible Dictionary that Leviticus chapters 1 through 7 gives the most detailed description of Israel's sacrificial system, including 5 types of sacrifices. The sacrifices and offerings that were brought by the people were to be the physical expression of their inward devotion. Those 5 types of sacrifice include the burnt offering, a grain offering, the peace offering, the sin offering, and a guilt or reparation offering. They continue noting that the prophets spoke harshly about the people's concept of sacrifice. They tended to ignore faith, confession, and devotion, thinking the mere act of sacrifice ensured forgiveness. That's the key word. Let's look at themes, topics, discussion, or sermon preparation ideas. The first might be when the Lord gives you rest. And of course, the Lord has given the nation of Israel rest, and we can take that personally as well, that we need rest. A second one might be obedience and sacrifice. A question that you might ask your listeners: Solomon made over 140,000 sacrifices at this dedication ceremony. Check verse 63. Is there a sacrificial system in use for Christians today? Now for the preview of next week's lesson. Next week is the first lesson of Unit 3 in the winter quarter. The title of Unit 3 is Jesus Teaches About True Worship. There are 4 lessons in Unit 3, and 3 of those lessons will come from the Gospel according to Matthew. Next week's lesson is titled Single-Minded Obedience and comes from Matthew, the 4th chapter, verses 1 through 11. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I am Reverend Dexter Alexander, and you've been listening to SundaySchoolPreacher.com. If you want to support this channel, I accept correspondence and gifts at my PayPal address, https://paypal.me/SundaySchoolPreacher, or correspondence at 1590 Jonesboro Road Southeast, Box 150032, Atlanta, Georgia 30315. Again, the only way I know this is helpful is if you subscribe, click the like button, or say so in the comments. Please also click the notifications bell so you'll be notified as soon as I upload next week's lesson. And if you don't mind, please share this site with other Sunday school teachers, preachers, and students. Thank you, and may God bless you real good.